The government's failed attempts to prosecute Queen Caroline for adultery in the House of Lords in the summer and autumn of 1820 triggered one of the most significant political crises of the early 19th century. The unprecedented nationwide popular movement that emerged in her support and the government's inability to prevent public protests had important consequences for the development of British politics. The previous year, a large public rally in Manchester calling for parliamentary reform, which was later dubbed the Peterloo Massacre, had been violently suppressed by the military. Fearing similar mass protests, the government passed the Six Acts in 1819, which banned all unofficial, large public meetings, outdoor processions, or demonstrations. It also became illegal to criticise the state in print, and punitive taxes were imposed on newspapers. Tory Prime Minister Lord Liverpool and Home Secretary Lord Sidmouth were determined to quash the threat of revolution and radically inspired insurrection. However, just a few months later, large public meetings and processions in support of the Queen swept the nation, leaving these hardline policies in tatters. The issue took possession of every house or cottage in the kingdom, recalled one observer. Every man, woman, and child took part in it. Nothing was thought of but the fate of the Queen's trial. Lord Sidmouth, along with many others who failed to display pro-Caroline illuminations at their properties, had his windows smashed. Tens of thousands of anti-government protesters regularly took to the streets of London, and the press, satirists, and cartoonists had a field day. Extraordinarily, this public protest attracted remarkably little reaction from the authorities. The Whig diarist Thomas Creevey MP noted with astonishment how every Wednesday the same scene which caused so much alarm at Manchester is repeated under the very nose of Parliament and all the constituted authorities. Part of the problem for the government was that the military were often involved. On one occasion, 5,000 sailors even marched to pay their own respects to the Queen. Another difficulty was the constitutional context. Although the Queen had separated from the King and was known to have had sexual affairs living abroad, her constitutional status had not changed. Loyalty to the Queen could hardly be deemed seditious or libellous, and obtaining official sanction from a sympathetic magistrate for a meeting in her support was not difficult. George IV's own notorious promiscuity added a moral dimension too. Fueled by the sympathy for the Queen and the indignation about double standards, women marched, spoke, and signed addresses in unprecedented numbers. With religious leaders and some members of the cabinet also deeply divided over her claims and treatment, the political and legal situation was far from straightforward. Perhaps the most significant factor inhibiting the government's response was the constitutional language and respect for historic institutions widely adopted by so many of the Queen's supporters. When the City of London Corporation petitioned the Commons, for instance, they denounced the Queen's trial as repugnant to the Constitution and dangerous to the honour and dignity of the Crown. Many leading reformers and radicals who rallied behind the Queen's cause used similar language, distancing themselves from the associations with the mob that had helped to trigger the government's repressive measures. Many activists in towns and cities who took the lead in organising support for the Queen went on to play an important role in local campaigns for municipal and parliamentary reform. In Taunton, the same people responsible for the meetings and petitions of 1820 helped to establish a growing local reform movement. At the local level, the Queen Caroline affair taught reformers and radicals important lessons about how to organise and manage political agitation in ways that were considered legitimate and constitutional. Leading Whig politicians whose campaigns for parliamentary reform had always been hampered by the more extreme radicals also welcomed the shift in politics resulting from the Queen Caroline affair. The Queen's business, observed Lord John Russell MP, has done a great deal in renewing the old and natural alliance between the Whigs and the people and weakening the influence of the violent radicals. When the government abandoned the Queen's trial in November 1820, realising they would never secure the parliamentary votes they needed, the whole nation celebrated. Whigs and radicals hoped the beleaguered Tory government would collapse, but popular support for the Queen quickly evaporated. By February 1821, the political climate had cooled, and the affair, to all intents and purposes, seemed over. Lord Liverpool's ministry had weathered the storm and survived. On the surface, little had changed, but at a local level, politics would never be quite the same.